Static cracked through my headset, and my heart dropped before my brain even caught up. 3 words came through the noise, broken, and stretched thin across the dead space between stars. "Help us, please." Then nothing. I was standing on the bridge of the reckoning, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and in the space of a heartbeat, that coffee was forgotten on the console beside me. My name is Elena Voss, and I was the tactical officer on a ship most of the galaxy had never heard of, patrolling a stretch of space that most of the galaxy pretended did not exist. That night, everything changed, and it changed fast. I do not have time to explain what the threshold line is before I tell you what happened, so let me just say this. It was a border, an invisible fence in the middle of nothing, drawn by species older and more careful than us, meant to keep young, unpredictable Earth on one side, and the rest of civilized space on the other. We were the new kids, the ones nobody trusted with sharp objects. That was about to change. The distress signal had come from a mining outpost called Vesa Hold, sitting just outside our side of the line, in a stretch of space, technically claimed by nobody, and protected by everybody, in theory, and nobody in practice. Vesa Hold was small, a few hundred workers, mostly Vakari and Slith, digging rare minerals out of an asteroid belt, because nobody else wanted the job. It was the kind of place the big fleets flew past without a second look. I pulled up the signal on my display and ran it twice to be sure I was not imagining it. It was real. Broken, stretched, dying, but real. Captain Doran was in Medical Bay 2, recovering from a reactor accident 3 days earlier that had nearly taken his arm and did take most of his voice. Command of the Reckoning had fallen to me in the meantime, a fact that felt like a joke until that exact moment, when it stopped being funny and became the only thing that mattered. I opened a channel to the bridge crew. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "We have a distress call from Vesa Hold, civilian mining colony. No response from any Allied fleet in range." Lieutenant Marcus Aldridge, my weapons officer, looked up from his station with an expression I would come to know very well over the following hours. It was the look of a man doing math he did not like the answer to. "Ma'am, that colony sits 11 hours outside our patrol boundary. Command protocol says we route the signal to the nearest Allied fleet and continue our assigned patrol." "I know what protocol says," I told him. "I want to know what is actually out there." Our sensors officer, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman named Priya Devan, was already working before I finished the sentence. That was the thing about my crew. They did not need to be told twice what mattered. She pulled up a secondary scan, cross-referencing it against traffic patterns from the last standard week. Her voice was flat and careful, the way people talk when they are trying not to let panic slip in. 3 unregistered vessels entered that sector 2 hours ago. Their transponders are broadcasting nothing. That is not weather interference. That is deliberate silence. "Pirates," Aldridge said, though he did not sound convinced by his own word. I was not convinced either. Pirates raided for profit and ran the moment resistance showed up. This did not smell like profit. It smelled like a test. I opened the general comm to every Allied contact within range. 3 separate fleets answered within minutes. Every single one gave me the same answer wrapped in different words. "Vesa Hold falls outside our jurisdiction. Engaging without a formal request from Dominion Command would violate the current peace framework. We recommend routing your resources elsewhere." I sat with that answer for exactly 4 seconds before I made my decision, because 4 seconds was already 3 seconds too many for the people trapped in that colony. "Set a course for Vesa Hold," I said. "Full burn. I want us there in under 2 hours, not 11. Aldridge hesitated, not out of fear, but because he understood exactly what he was being asked to sign his name to. "Ma'am, if this goes wrong, if this is a trap or an internal Dominion matter dressed up as a distress call, we are the ones standing alone out there. No backup, no official sanction, just us." "I know," I told him. "That is exactly why we are going, because everyone else already decided the people on that colony were not worth the risk. I am not deciding that, not today, not ever." Something shifted in the room after I said that. I felt it more than saw it. Priya's hands moved faster across her console. Aldridge straightened in his chair and started running weapons diagnostics without being asked. Our helmsman, a young man named Colin Bridger who rarely spoke unless spoken to, quietly angled the ship toward the edge of our patrol boundary and beyond it, into space where our authorization did not technically exist. The Reckoning was not the biggest ship in the fleet. She was not the newest either. But she was fast. She was armed heavier than her class usually allowed, and she was crewed by people who had spent years being told they were the backup plan, the second choice, the ones called in only after every other option had failed. I think that history mattered more than anyone back on Earth understood. It shaped how we thought about waiting. We did not wait. 2 hours at full burn feels different than 2 hours anywhere else. Time does not pass evenly when you know people are dying somewhere ahead of you, and you cannot do a single thing to speed up physics. I spent that time going over every scrap of information Priya could pull about Vesa Hold, about the unregistered ships, about the pattern of silence spreading across that sector like ink through water. What I found did not comfort me. The 3 unregistered vessels matched a hull signature the Dominion officially claimed did not exist anymore. A design retired 2 decades ago after what their own historical records vaguely called an incident along a contested border. Ships that were not supposed to be flying, crewed by people who were not supposed to be there, attacking a colony that officially had no strategic value. None of it made sense as piracy. All of it made sense as something else. A message, a test aimed at exactly the kind of gap in the system we were currently flying straight into. I did not share every detail with the crew right away. Some fears are better carried quietly by the person responsible for making the final call, but I did share enough. This is not random, I told them, an hour out from the colony. Whoever is doing this wants to see what happens when nobody with real teeth shows up. I intend to be the answer they were not expecting. Nobody argued with me. Nobody asked me to reconsider. I have thought about that a lot since. Somewhere along the way, without a formal decision or an announcement, the crew of the Reckoning had already decided who we were going to be out here. I was just the one saying it out loud first. 40 minutes from Vesa Hold, Priya's console lit up with a fresh reading, and her voice lost the careful flatness it usually carried. Ma'am, I am picking up weapons fire. Small arms, not ship to ship. It is coming from inside the colony structure itself. That single sentence told me everything protocol reports never could. This was not a hostage standoff waiting patiently for negotiation. This was happening right now, in real time, to people who did not have 2 hours to spare, let alone the additional 40 minutes it would take us to arrive. I want a full sensor sweep the second we drop out of transit, I said. I want to know exactly what we are walking into before we are standing in the middle of it. Understood, Priya answered, already recalibrating the array. Aldridge ran final diagnostics on every weapon system twice, then a third time, not because he needed to, but because his hands needed something to do with the tension building in the room. Colin kept his eyes locked on the transit countdown, jaw tight, saying nothing. I stood at the center of the bridge and thought about every excuse the Allied fleets had given me for staying away. Jurisdiction, framework, formal requests, words designed by people who had never once had to listen to a distress call go silent mid-sentence. I thought about Captain Doran, resting in Medical Bay 2, trusting that whoever held the chair in his absence would make the same call he would have made. I hoped I was right about that. I still hope it now, looking back. The transit countdown hit 0, and the stars around us stretched, folded, and snapped back into place, and there it was. Vesa Hold, hanging in the black like a wounded animal, lights flickering across its outer hull. 3 unmarked ships positioned around it in a formation that had nothing to do with mining inspection and everything to do with control.
Ma'am,
Priya said, voice tight.
I am reading heavy casualties inside the colony structure.
Life signs dropping in real time, and the unregistered vessels have already spotted us. They are moving. I looked at the tactical display, at the small flickering dots representing lives still counting down inside that station, and I felt the last trace of hesitation leave my body entirely. All stations, I said, weapons hot. We are not here to negotiate. We are here to end this. Aldridge's hands moved across his console, with a calm precision that surprised even me. Weapons online. Targeting solutions locked on all 3 vessels. Colin, I said, get us between those ships and the colony. Now. Yes, ma'am, he answered, and the Reckoning surged forward, cutting the distance in a way that must have looked, from the perspective of whoever was piloting those unregistered vessels, like something they had not planned for. Their formation broke almost immediately, ships peeling away from their fixed positions, weapons charging, but a half-second too slow, a half-second too surprised. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, that every single one of those allied fleets, who told us this was not our jurisdiction, had just handed us the only advantage that mattered. Surprise. Nobody out here was expecting a human ship to actually come. They were about to learn why that assumption had been a mistake. The first shots exchanged were not the ones that decided the fight, but they were the ones that told me everything about the kind of engagement we had just walked into. The unregistered vessels fired in short, testing bursts, weapons calibrated for intimidation rather than immediate destruction, the way predators test the strength of prey before committing fully. Aldridge did not test anything. On my order, the Reckoning answered with everything she had, full spread, no calibration for intimidation, only for ending the threat as completely and as quickly as physics allowed. I will not pretend that moment was easy. There is a difference between defending your own ship and choosing, deliberately, to place yourself between danger and strangers you have never met. But I did not have time to sit with that difference. I only had time to act on it. The nearest unregistered vessel took the brunt of our first full volley and staggered out of formation, systems flaring, momentum carrying it in an uncontrolled drift away from the colony. It was not destroyed, not yet, but it was no longer a threat to anyone but itself. The second vessel broke hard, attempting to circle behind us, clearly expecting the kind of slow, cautious response every other patrol in this region had trained them to expect. Colin anticipated the move before I even gave the order, angling the Reckoning into a turn so tight it pressed every one of us against our restraints, keeping our forward weapons locked on target the entire time. Priya's voice cut through the tension. Third vessel is breaking off. They are retreating toward the line. Let them go, I said. Focus everything on protecting the colony. It was not mercy that made that decision for me. It was priority. The people trapped inside Vesa Hold did not have the luxury of waiting for us to finish a fight that no longer threatened them directly. Every second we spent chasing a retreating ship was a second stolen from someone bleeding out on that station. Aldridge redirected fire toward the second vessel, which was still attempting its flanking maneuver, and within moments it too broke off, damaged, and clearly unwilling to continue pressing an engagement that had turned far more costly, far more quickly, than whoever commanded it had anticipated. The first vessel, still drifting, attempted one final desperate volley, aimed not at us, but at the colony itself, a parting shot, meant to inflict damage even in retreat. I do not remember giving the order to intercept. I remember only the decision forming and my body acting on it in the same instant, a reflex built from every hour of training and every conversation about what we owed the people we had come to protect. The Reckoning moved between that final shot and the colony's already damaged hull, absorbing the impact along our forward shielding instead. The ship shuddered. Alarms flared briefly across 3 separate stations before Priya silenced them, confirming no critical damage. And then, just like that, the remaining hostile vessels broke fully and retreated, faster than they had arrived, back toward the line and whatever waited for them on the other side. Silence settled across the bridge, the kind of silence that comes after a held breath finally releases. I looked at the tactical display, at the colony still intact, still holding, still alive, and felt something settle in my chest that I would spend the following hours trying to name. We had done it. We had answered a call nobody else would touch, and we had ended it before it could finish what it started. But even as I gave the order to open a channel to Vesa Hold, even as I heard the first shaking, grateful voice answer from inside that damaged colony, I understood, somewhere in the back of my mind, that this was not the end of anything. It was only the very beginning. The voice on the other end of the channel belonged to a Vakari named Thural, her words shaking so badly at first that Priya had to boost the audio filter twice before we could understand her clearly. She kept repeating the same phrase, over and over, as if she could not quite believe it was true. You came. You actually came. I did not have a good answer for why every other fleet had chosen silence, while we chose to fly 11 hours off our assigned patrol boundary. I only had the truth, which was simpler than any explanation. Someone called for help. We were close enough to answer. Thural's voice cracked on the other end. Close enough is not how anyone else has ever described Vesa Hold. We are not close to anything. In the eyes of the fleets who are supposed to protect this region, we are a rounding error, a colony too small to matter. I let that sit for a moment before I answered. You matter enough that I burned 2 hours of fuel getting here faster than any ship in this sector was supposed to move. That should tell you something. I ordered Colin to bring us alongside the damaged section of the colony, while Aldridge kept weapons trained on the empty space where the retreating vessels had vanished, just in case this was not truly over. Priya ran continuous scans, searching for any sign the attackers intended to circle back once our guard was down. They will not return tonight, Priya said eventually, though her tone carried no real certainty, only the kind of hope a person allows themselves after living through something terrible. Their trajectory shows a direct line back toward Dominion space. Whatever this was, it appears finished for now. For now was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and I noticed it. I filed the thought away and turned my attention to the immediate task in front of me, which was getting a medical team onto that station, before more lives slipped away in the time it took us to finish talking about jurisdiction and protocol. I assembled a small boarding party myself, against Aldridge's quiet objection that command should remain on the bridge during an active, if paused, hostile situation. I understood his concern. I made the decision anyway, because I did not think it was fair to ask people to trust a captain who sent others into danger without ever stepping into it herself. The corridors of Vesa Hold told a story, before a single survivor said a word to us. Scorched walls. Sealed emergency doors that had clearly been welded shut from the inside, in a desperate attempt to slow down whoever had been moving through the station. Debris scattered in patterns that spoke of people running, not walking, away from something they had no way to fight. We found the surviving colonists gathered in the deepest section of the mining complex, sealed behind 3 layers of emergency barriers, exhausted, frightened, and clearly convinced that whoever opened that final door was more likely to be their attackers returning than their rescue arriving. When the door finally opened and they saw human uniforms instead of the vessels that had been tearing through their home for the better part of a day, the reaction was not relief exactly. It was something closer to disbelief, the kind of stunned silence that takes a long moment to catch up with reality. Thurl stepped forward first among them, taller than me by a full head, with pale blue skin and dark eyes that studied me with an intensity I would come to understand much better over the following weeks. She was young for a diplomat in training, barely more than a junior aide assigned to Vesa Hold as part of a minor trade oversight rotation, never meant to witness anything close to what had happened that day. "You should not have come," she said quietly, even as the rest of the colonists began moving past us toward the medical team we had brought aboard. It was not a complaint. It sounded almost like a warning. I asked her why, and her answer stayed with me long after that day ended. Because now they know a human ship will answer a call nobody else will. And in this part of the galaxy, that kind of information changes how people plan. I did not fully understand what she meant in that moment, standing in a corridor still smelling of scorched metal and fear, surrounded by people who had spent the last several hours certain they were going to die alone and forgotten. I understood it far better later, once I had time to piece together everything that happened after. The medical teams worked through what remained of that night, stabilizing the wounded, treating the kind of injuries that come from people trying to defend themselves with mining tools against attackers who came prepared for a real fight. We lost 3 colonists before our medics could reach them. I carry that number with me still. It sits quietly at the back of every decision I have made since that day, a reminder of exactly how much a few hours, or a few minutes, can cost. But we saved over 200 others. People who would not have made it through the night if the reckoning had followed protocol, and simply routed their distress call to a fleet that had no intention of answering it in time. While the medical teams worked, I asked Thurl to walk me through everything she remembered about the attack. From the very first moment, the unregistered vessels had appeared on colony sensors. I needed to understand not just what had happened, but why, because nothing about the pattern I was seeing matched ordinary piracy, and I trusted my instincts enough by that point to know I was not imagining the difference. She told me the vessels had arrived without warning, jamming outgoing communications almost immediately, which explained why the colony's first distress call had been so fragmented and delayed. They had moved through the mining complex with a discipline that did not match typical raiders, targeting infrastructure and personnel with what felt, to her, like deliberate restraint rather than random violence. They were not trying to destroy us, she said. They were trying to see how long it would take before someone stopped them. And they clearly expected the answer to be a very long time, or perhaps never. I asked her directly if she believed this was connected to the Dominion, and I watched something careful and guarded settle over her expression before she answered. I cannot confirm that officially, but unofficially, the hull design on those vessels belongs to a class my government retired from service decades ago. Ships like that are not supposed to exist anymore, which means someone with resources most raiders do not have decided this colony was worth the risk of using them anyway. That single sentence reframed everything I thought I understood about the mission we had just completed. This was not a rescue that happened to interrupt a random act of violence. It was a rescue that had interrupted something being tested, deliberately, in a region of space specifically chosen because nobody was supposed to be watching closely enough to notice. And we had noticed. Worse, from whoever's perspective had authorized that test, we had responded. I returned to the bridge as the last of the wounded were being transferred into stable care, and I found Aldridge waiting for me with a report that confirmed exactly what I feared. Long-range sensors had picked up a brief, encrypted transmission, originating from the retreating vessels moments before they crossed back over the threshold line, aimed toward a relay point deep inside Dominion territory. "They are reporting back," Aldridge said. Whoever sent them wanted eyes on what happened here, and now they have them. I sat in the captain's chair for the first time since taking command, not because the moment called for ceremony, but because my legs finally admitted how long they had been standing without rest. I looked at the tactical display, at the quiet, damaged colony behind us, at the empty space where the attacking vessels had vanished, and I understood, with total clarity, that whatever we had just done, it was not going to stay contained to this one small, forgotten station. Priya broke the silence carefully. "Ma'am, Command is requesting an immediate report. They are asking for full details on unauthorized engagement outside our patrol boundary." Of course they were. I had expected nothing less. Protocol did not simply disappear because we had made the right decision. If anything, making the right decision outside the boundaries of official permission was exactly the kind of thing that invited scrutiny. "Send them everything," I said. "Every scan, every recording, every casualty report. I am not going to hide what we did here." Aldridge glanced at me, something unreadable in his expression. "You know this is going to get complicated. Command does not like unauthorized action, even when it saves lives, especially when it saves lives, sometimes, because it raises questions about why the authorized response failed to arrive at all." "I know," I told him. "Let it get complicated. I would rather answer difficult questions about why we acted than easy ones about why we did not." Thurl remained aboard the Reckoning through the following hours, coordinating between her surviving colonists and the medical team still working to stabilize the most critical cases. At one point, while the two of us stood near the observation window watching the slow, careful transfer of supplies toward the damaged colony, she asked me a question I did not have a ready answer for. "Why did you come, truly?" Not the official answer, the real one. I thought about it for a long moment before I spoke, because I owed her an honest answer after everything she had lived through that day. Because somewhere back home, a very long time ago, humanity learned the hard way what happens when people wait too long to help each other. We do not always get it right. We do not always agree on when to act. But when someone calls for help and we are close enough to answer, we do not spend hours debating jurisdiction while they die waiting for permission. Thurl studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, though I could not yet name what it was. "That is not how anyone else out here operates," she said quietly. "I do not think you understand yet what that difference is going to mean." I did not understand it, not fully, not that night. But I would, very soon. And so would the rest of the galaxy watching from a careful, cautious distance, quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about the newest, youngest species to reach the stars. We had answered one distress call. We had no idea yet how many more were waiting, or how quickly the silence surrounding us was about to break. Command's response arrived 9 hours later, and it was not the reprimand Aldridge had braced for. It was worse, in its own quiet way, because it was silence, dressed up as procedure, a formal acknowledgement of our report, A note that the matter would be reviewed by a joint oversight committee, and no further instructions beyond continuing our patrol as if nothing unusual had happened at all. I read that message twice, standing alone in the small officers' quarters I rarely had time to use, and I felt something settle into place that had been building in me since the moment we crossed the threshold line. This was not simply about one colony, one attack, one delayed response from Allied fleets who valued careful language over decisive action. This was about an entire system, built around the assumption that young species, especially humans, were meant to wait for permission before acting, even when lives were counting down in real time. I called Aldridge and Priya into the small briefing room off the bridge, and I asked them both the same question I had been turning over in my mind for hours. Why does everyone else out here move so carefully, even when moving carefully costs lives? Priya answered first, because she had spent more time than either of us studying the diplomatic archives we carried on board for exactly this kind of situation. It is not caution the way we understand it, she said. It is doctrine. Every major species out here built its military and diplomatic systems around avoiding total conflict at almost any cost, because most of them remember exactly what total conflict looked like the last time it happened between two major powers, and none of them ever want to see it again. That sounded reasonable on its surface, and I told her so. But reasonable doctrine should still leave room for immediate action when civilians are dying in real time. What I saw today was not caution. It was paralysis, dressed up as policy. Aldridge leaned forward, arms crossed, the way he always did when he was working through a problem out loud. Maybe paralysis is exactly the point. If every response requires committee approval, formal review, cross-fleet coordination, then nobody individual actor can ever be blamed for acting too slowly. The system protects itself first, and the people it is supposed to serve second. I thought about that for a long time after the meeting ended, turning it over the way you turn over a stone, looking for what is hiding underneath. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood something about humanity that I do not think most of us had ever said out loud, not even to ourselves. We came from a history that never allowed us the comfort of slow, careful committees deciding whether saving lives was worth the diplomatic complications. Earth's own past was full of moments where waiting cost everything, where careful, measured responses to urgent danger meant the difference between saving a city and watching it fall. We did not learn that lesson from any external teacher, guiding us gently toward wisdom. We learned it from surviving our own worst mistakes, over and over, until the lesson became part of how we built everything that came after, including how we built our ships, our chains of command, and the instincts that told me, without hesitation, to burn 2 hours of fuel toward a colony most of the galaxy had already decided was not worth saving. Thurl found me later that evening, still working through the archived history files Priya had pulled together, and she sat across from me without asking permission, which by that point felt entirely natural between us. "You are troubled," she said. It was not a question. I told her what I had been thinking, about doctrine, about paralysis, about the strange, uncomfortable realization that humanity's willingness to act quickly was not some accident of temperament, but the direct result of a history soaked in the kind of loss that teaches you never to wait when waiting costs lives. She listened carefully, the way she listened to everything, with an intensity that made you feel like your words mattered enough to deserve her full attention. "We have a history too," she said eventually. "Every species does. But my people's history was shaped differently. We were guided into space by an older civilization, one that had already fought its worst wars centuries before we existed as a spacefaring people. They taught us their doctrine, their caution, their careful, measured approach to conflict, because it had already worked for them. We inherited wisdom secondhand, without ever having to bleed for it ourselves." I asked her what that meant, practically, for how her people responded to crisis, and her answer explained more about that day than anything else had. "It means we trust systems more than instinct. It means when something falls outside the framework we were taught, we hesitate, because we were never taught what to do with a threat that does not follow the rules everyone agreed to respect. Your instinct to act immediately, without waiting for permission, is not something my people are trained to understand. It is something we are trained to be cautious of, because history has taught us that unchecked, immediate force is exactly how the old wars started. I understood her point, and I did not dismiss it. There was real wisdom in caution, real value in systems built to prevent conflict from spiraling out of control before anyone had time to consider the consequences. But I also understood, with growing clarity, that caution built entirely around avoiding conflict had left an opening, and someone out there had just tested exactly how wide that opening was. They were not testing whether they could destroy a mining colony, I said slowly, working through the thought as I spoke it aloud. They were testing whether anyone would answer quickly enough to stop them. And for a long time, the answer everyone expected was no. Thoral's expression grew very still. And now the answer is different. Now there is a ship out here that did not hesitate, did not wait for permission, and ended the engagement before it could finish playing out the way it was designed to. Yes, I said, and that is going to matter far more than either of us fully understands yet. She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before, not even in the immediate aftermath of the attack. You should understand something about how the wider galaxy is going to interpret what happened today. It will not be interpreted as a rescue. Not entirely. It will be interpreted as a demonstration. Whoever authorized that test now knows exactly how a human ship responds under pressure, with no formal authorization, no backup, no hesitation. That knowledge changes calculations across an entire region of space, and not always in ways either of us would choose. I sat with that warning long after she left to check on the surviving colonists, turning it over alongside everything else Priya and Aldridge had raised earlier that day. The picture forming in my mind was not comforting, but it was clarifying, and clarity, even uncomfortable clarity, has always mattered more to me than comfortable uncertainty. Humanity had spent years living quietly on the edge of galactic society, treated as a curiosity, a young species still finding its footing, kept carefully contained behind boundaries drawn by others who assumed we would eventually grow into their careful, measured way of doing things. Nobody out here had planned for the possibility that we might grow into something else entirely, something shaped by a very different history, carrying very different instincts about when caution served a purpose and when it simply became another word for abandonment. I did not know yet how far that realization was going to spread, or how quickly. I only knew, standing alone in that small officer's quarters with a stack of archived history files still glowing on my display, that the quiet, careful assumptions the galaxy had built about humanity were about to be tested far more thoroughly than one colony, one distress call, one delayed response ever could have tested them alone. We had answered honestly, without hesitation, exactly as our history had shaped us to answer, and somewhere out beyond the threshold line, in rooms and councils we could not see, people were beginning to ask a question that would define everything that came next. What exactly had they been keeping on the other side of that border, and had they truly understood, until this very moment, what it meant? I did not have an answer for them yet, but I intended to find out exactly how loudly that question was about to echo, and whether the reckoning would be standing at the center of it when it finally did. The Dominion cruiser arrived 3 days later, and it did not announce itself the way I expected. There was no warning transmission, no formal request to approach. One moment the space beyond Vesa hold was empty, and the next, a vessel 3 times the size of the Reckoning, was sitting silently at the edge of our sensor range, running dark, its intentions unclear. Priya flagged it immediately, her voice tight, with the kind of controlled alarm I had come to recognize as her default response to genuine danger. "Ma'am, we have a contact. Dominion configuration, cruiser class. It is not broadcasting identification, and it has not requested permission to enter the sector." I stood from the captain's chair and walked to the main display, watching the slow, deliberate approach of a ship, clearly built to project authority, without needing to say a single word. This was not a rescue vessel. This was not a diplomatic envoy arriving to check on the survivors of an attack. This was something else entirely, and I understood exactly what it was before Aldridge said it out loud. "That is not a rescue mission," he said quietly. "That is an inspection, or worse, a reprimand." I agreed with him, though I kept my expression carefully neutral for the benefit of the rest of the bridge crew, who were watching me for cues about how worried they should allow themselves to be. "Open a channel," I said. "Let us hear what they have to say before we assume anything." The channel opened after a delay clearly designed to feel deliberate rather than technical. The voice that came through was calm, measured, and carried the particular kind of authority that comes from someone who has never once had to raise their voice to be obeyed. This is Fleet Commander Vesic, of the Dominion vessel Ashal Vantar. We are here to investigate reports of unauthorized military action within a contested border region. All vessels are instructed to power down offensive systems and prepare to receive an inspection team. I let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds before I answered, because I understood, even then, that how I responded in this exact moment was going to matter far more than anything I had said or done since the moment we first answered the distress call. This is Commander Elena Voss of the human vessel Reckoning. We responded to an active distress call from a civilian colony under attack by unregistered hostile vessels. That is not unauthorized military action. That is a rescue. I am not powering down defensive systems while an unidentified cruiser approaches without prior clearance. There was a pause on the other end, longer than the first, and I understood that pause meant something. Fleet Commander Vesic had not expected refusal. Every Allied fleet operating anywhere near the threshold line had spent years demonstrating exactly the kind of careful, deferential caution that made a request like his feel routine, almost automatic. I was not giving him routine. When his voice returned, it carried a slightly different edge, though still carefully controlled. Commander Voss, I would remind you that your vessel operated outside its designated patrol boundary, without formal authorization from any recognized regional authority. This alone warrants review, regardless of your stated intentions. I looked across the bridge at Aldridge, who gave me a small, steady nod, the kind that told me he was with me completely, whatever came next. I looked at Priya, whose hands remained steady on her console despite the tension radiating through the room. I looked, finally, at Colin, whose eyes stayed fixed on his controls, ready to move the moment I gave the order, whatever that order turned out to be. Fleet Commander, I said, choosing my words carefully now. I understand that my actions fell outside the formal framework your fleets operate under. I am not disputing that. What I am disputing is the idea that following a framework matters more than saving the lives of people who were actively dying while every authorized fleet in range decided whether jurisdiction technically applied to their survival. Another pause, shorter this time, and when he spoke again, I could hear something new underneath the careful authority in his voice. Something closer to genuine uncertainty. You understand, Commander Voss, that actions like yours create instability. Other species watching this exchange will draw conclusions about what humans consider acceptable, unilateral action. That instability has consequences far beyond one small colony. I thought about Thurl, still aboard the Reckoning, still recovering from an attack that had killed 3 people she had known personally, people whose deaths could have been prevented if any fleet with authority had simply chosen to act instead of debate. I thought about the 200 survivors who would not exist if we had waited for the same permission Fleet Commander Vesic seemed to believe mattered more than their lives. With respect, Fleet Commander, I said, the instability already existed. It existed the moment 3 unregistered vessels using a hull design your own government supposedly retired decades ago, attacked a civilian colony, and expected nobody capable of stopping them to arrive in time. We did not create that instability. We interrupted it. I watched Priya's console flicker, a new reading appearing that made her sit up straighter. Ma'am, she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that it would not carry over the open channel. I am detecting additional vessels entering the sector. Configuration matches long-range human patrol craft. They are holding position at the edge of sensor range, but they are here. I felt something shift in my chest, a mixture of relief and grim understanding. Command back on Earth had clearly anticipated exactly this kind of escalation the moment our initial report reached them, and rather than issuing a formal reprimand, they had quietly moved reinforcements toward the threshold line, prepared for the possibility that this confrontation might happen. Nobody had told me directly. I understood now why. They had wanted my response to Fleet Commander Vesic to be genuine, unshaped by knowledge of backup waiting just beyond the horizon. I did not mention the newly arrived vessels over the open channel. I did not need to. I suspected Fleet Commander Vesic's own sensors were already picking up the same readings Priya had just flagged, and the silence that followed on his end suggested exactly that. When he spoke again, his tone had changed entirely, the careful authority replaced by something more measured. more genuinely curious than commanding. "Commander Voss, may I ask you a direct question, outside the framework of this formal inspection?" I told him he could ask, though I made no promises about answering. "Did your command authorize reinforcements to this sector, in anticipation of this exact confrontation, before you had any knowledge those reinforcements were being deployed?" I considered lying, briefly, and decided against it, because I understood that honesty, in this exact moment, would communicate something far more valuable than any calculated deception could. "Yes," I said simply. I believe they did. The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 full seconds, long enough that Aldridge glanced at me with barely concealed surprise at my willingness to confirm it so directly. But I had a reason for that honesty, one I only fully understood as I watched it land on the other end of the channel. Fleet Commander Vesik's voice, when it finally returned, carried none of its earlier formal authority. It carried something closer to quiet, careful reassessment. "That is not typical behavior for a species we categorized as reactive rather than strategic," he said, more to himself than to me, though the open channel carried it clearly to everyone listening on both sides. I decided to answer that observation directly, because I understood it mattered more than almost anything else I could say in that moment. "Fleet Commander, humanity is not reactive. We are decisive. There is a difference, and I think today is the first time anyone from your side of the threshold line has had the opportunity to see it clearly. We do not wait for formal permission to prevent avoidable deaths, but we are also not careless. My command anticipated this exact confrontation and prepared for it accordingly, quietly, without needing to announce their preparation in advance. That is not instability, Fleet Commander. That is exactly the kind of measured strategic thinking your own doctrine claims to value. We simply do not let that thinking slow down our response when lives are actively at risk." The pause that followed felt different from every pause before it. I could not see Fleet Commander Vesik's face, could not read whatever expression crossed it as he processed what I had just said, but I understood, somehow, that something had shifted permanently in how this conversation was going to end. "I will be filing a full report of this encounter with Dominion High Command," he said eventually, his voice returning to something like formal procedure, though the underlying tone had changed entirely. "This matter will require further review at levels beyond my authority to resolve here." "I understand," I told him. "I will be filing an equally complete report with my own command. I do not believe either of us has anything to hide about what actually happened here." The channel closed shortly after that, and the Dominion cruiser held its position for nearly 20 minutes before finally withdrawing, moving back toward the threshold line, at a pace that felt, to everyone watching on the Reckoning's bridge, distinctly less confident than its arrival had been. Aldridge exhaled slowly once the cruiser's signature faded from our sensors entirely. That could have gone very differently. It could have, I agreed. But it did not, because we were honest about who we are, and what we were willing to do. And honesty, it turns out, is a very difficult thing to argue with. Priya looked up from her console. Her earlier tension had eased into something closer to quiet astonishment. "Ma'am, the reinforcement vessels are already breaking formation, heading back to their original patrol assignments. Command must have called them off the moment the Dominion cruiser withdrew." "Good," I said. "That means Command trusted us to handle this correctly, and I intend to prove that trust was well placed." Thurl found me on the observation deck later that evening, watching the empty space where the Dominion cruiser had been, and she stood beside me in silence for a long while, before finally speaking. "You understood something today that I do not think even you fully realized until it was happening," she said quietly. I asked her what she meant. "You showed him honesty instead of strength, and it unsettled him far more deeply than strength alone ever could have. Strength, my people know how to calculate and counter. Honesty backed by genuine willingness to act, without needing to hide behind careful language or diplomatic evasion. That is something none of us has fully learned how to prepare for." I thought about that for a long time after she left, standing alone with the quiet hum of the ship around me, and I understood, with growing clarity, that whatever had just happened between the Reckoning and that Dominion cruiser was not the end of this story. It was only the moment the rest of the galaxy finally started paying real attention. And attention, I was quickly learning, was not something humanity had ever truly experienced before, not like this. not from a galaxy suddenly realizing it had drastically underestimated exactly what kind of species it had been keeping carefully contained behind an invisible line in the dark. In the days following the Dominion cruiser's withdrawal, something changed aboard the Reckoning, something quiet and gradual that I did not fully notice until I looked back on it much later. Thurl began spending most of her waking hours in the small archive room near the crew quarters, working through the limited historical records we carried on board. Records meant mostly for cultural orientation rather than deep study, but records nonetheless. I found her there on the fourth evening after the standoff, surrounded by display screens filled with fragments of human history, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You should not be reading all of that at once," I told her, only half joking. "It is a lot to take in, even for us." She looked up at me, and there was something in her eyes I had not seen before, a mixture of fascination and something closer to quiet unease. "I am trying to understand," she said. "Not just what happened today, but why it happened the way it did. Why your command trusted you to act without asking permission first. Why your instinct was to move immediately instead of waiting for authorization. I thought I would find the answer in your military doctrine, but your doctrine only describes what you do. It does not explain why." I pulled up a chair and sat across from her, curious now myself about what she had found buried in those archives. "What have you learned so far?" She turned one of the displays toward me, and I recognized the file immediately. A summary of a period in Earth's history most school children learned about in careful, sanitized fragments. A period when entire regions of the planet had been consumed by conflicts that lasted years, sometimes decades. Conflicts born from exactly the kind of slow, careful, bureaucratic hesitation that Fleet Commander Vesik's doctrine still relied upon. "I did not understand at first," Thurl said quietly. "I thought this was simply a record of violence, the kind of history every young species carries before it learns to move past it. But the more I read, the more I realized it was not a record of violence for its own sake. It was a record of what happens when help arrives too late, over and over, until an entire civilization finally decided it would rather act too quickly than watch that pattern repeat one more time." I nodded slowly, because she had understood something that took most humans years to fully articulate, even to ourselves. "We do not celebrate our history," I told her. "Much of it is difficult to look at directly, but we do not hide from it either, because forgetting it would mean forgetting exactly why we built the instincts we carry now. Every fast decision, every willingness to act without waiting for formal permission, exists because somewhere in our past, waiting cost more lives than acting ever did." Thurl was quiet for a long moment, scrolling slowly through another file, this one detailing a period of rebuilding and cooperation that followed one of history's darkest chapters, a period where humanity had deliberately chosen to build systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of drawn-out, bureaucratic paralysis that had cost so much in the conflicts before it. "This is what confuses my people the most," she said finally. "We assumed, because you were new to space travel, because you had no older civilization guiding your development the way mine did, that you were simply undisciplined, reactive, emotional, in the way your fleet commander Vesik implied during your exchange. But this is not undisciplined. This is discipline built from a completely different source than ours." I asked her to explain what she meant by that, and her answer stayed with me for a long time afterward. "My people were uplifted," she said. "An older civilization found us before we ever reached the stars on our own, and they taught us everything. Our diplomatic frameworks, our military doctrine, our careful, measured approach to conflict resolution. We inherited their wisdom fully formed, without ever having to survive the mistakes that created it in the first place. It made us careful, but it also made us dependent on frameworks we never had to build ourselves, and frameworks built by someone else do not always account for situations they never anticipated." She paused, looking directly at me now, and I understood she was working through something important, something that mattered beyond simple curiosity about human history. "You built your own frameworks," she continued. "Through loss, through failure, through centuries of learning exactly what happens when the wrong lesson gets applied at the wrong moment. Nobody handed you a doctrine that told you how to behave when a distress call arrives from outside your jurisdiction. You built the instinct to answer that call yourselves, the hard way. And that is precisely what my people, what the entire Dominion, failed to account for when they decided humanity could be safely contained behind the threshold line, while everyone else quietly continued business as usual. I thought about Fleet Commander Vesik's voice during our exchange, the genuine surprise underneath his formal authority when he realized Command had anticipated the confrontation before it happened. I thought about every Allied fleet that had refused to answer the original distress call, citing jurisdiction and formal frameworks, while people died waiting for permission that was never going to arrive in time. They assumed we would eventually grow into their way of doing things, I said slowly, understanding the shape of it fully myself for the first time. They assumed being young meant being unformed, waiting to be shaped by whoever guided us next. They never considered that we might already be fully formed by something else entirely, something we built ourselves, without needing anyone's permission or guidance to get there. Thurl nodded slowly. And now that assumption has been proven wrong in the most public way possible. A Dominion cruiser withdrew from a confrontation with a single human vessel, because that vessel's commander demonstrated exactly the kind of decisive, prepared strategic thinking my people believed only came from centuries of careful, guided development. You did not need centuries. You needed only your own history, and you had already survived enough of it. I sat with her in that small archive room for a long time after that conversation, both of us quiet, both of us processing the weight of what she had just articulated. I thought about Captain Doran, still recovering in medical bay, who would eventually read the full report of everything that had happened while he was unable to command, and I wondered what he would think of the decisions I had made in his absence. I thought about the crew, about Aldridge's steady hands at his weapons console, about Priya's careful, precise readings under pressure, about Colin's silent, immediate response every time I gave an order that required split-second execution. None of them had hesitated when it mattered. None of them had waited for permission they knew was never going to arrive in time. They had acted the way our history had shaped us to act, without needing anyone to explain why that instinct mattered. Thurl pulled up one final file before we left the archive room that evening, a brief record of humanity's earliest tentative steps into space, decades before the threshold line existed, before the wider galaxy had any knowledge of our existence at all. It was a simple record, almost mundane compared to everything else we had discussed, showing early exploration missions, careful scientific expansion, humanity reaching toward the stars entirely alone, without guidance, without an older civilization watching over our shoulder to correct our mistakes before they happened. You did all of this without anyone teaching you how, she said quietly, studying the file with an expression I can only describe as genuine wonder. Every mistake, every correction, every hard lesson about when to wait and when to act immediately, you learned entirely on your own, with no external source to blame or credit for the outcome. Yes, I told her, that is exactly what happened, and I think that is precisely what your fleet commander Vesik, and everyone he answers to, is only now beginning to understand about who we actually are. She looked at me then, with an expression that had shifted somewhere during our conversation, moving from careful diplomatic curiosity into something closer to genuine respect, mixed with an unmistakable undercurrent of concern. I do not think my people fully understand yet what it means to encounter a species that learned everything the hard way, entirely on its own, she said. We assumed young meant inexperienced. We never considered that young might simply mean recently arrived, while the experience underneath was already ancient in everything but years. I did not have a response for that immediately, because I understood, sitting there in that quiet archive room, that she had just articulated something the rest of the galaxy was only beginning to grapple with themselves. Humanity was not a young species waiting to be shaped by someone older and wiser. We were a species that had already shaped ourselves, through centuries of difficult, costly lessons, long before we ever set foot beyond our own solar system. And now, for the first time, the rest of the galaxy was beginning to understand exactly what that meant, watching carefully, cautiously, from every corner of civilized space, as word of what happened at Vesa Hold began spreading far beyond the small mining colony where it had all started. News travels strangely across the space between stars. It does not move the way it moves on a single planet, spreading evenly outward through familiar channels. It moves in bursts, carried by ships and relay stations and careful diplomatic cables, arriving in some places within hours and taking weeks to reach others, distorted and reshaped by every telling along the way. By the time the story of Vesa Hold reached the outer reaches of Dominion space, it barely resembled what had actually happened, and yet, somehow, the core of it remained intact everywhere it traveled. A human ship had answered a call nobody else would touch, and when confronted about it, had not backed down. I learned most of this secondhand, through reports command forwarded to the Reckoning over the following weeks, and through Thurl, who maintained careful contact with colleagues across several minor diplomatic postings scattered throughout the region. What she described to me painted a picture far larger than I had expected, one that made me understand just how deeply that single confrontation had rippled outward. "There is an emergency council convening," she told me one evening, roughly 2 weeks after the Dominion cruiser's withdrawal, her expression carefully composed in the way it always was when she was delivering information she found genuinely significant. "Multiple species with holdings near the threshold line have requested a full reassessment of current border policy. Your command has been formally invited to send a representative." I asked her what that meant, practically, and she took a long moment before answering, choosing her words with obvious care. "It means the assumption my people built their entire border strategy around. The assumption that humanity could be safely contained and gradually integrated into existing frameworks over time is being questioned at the highest levels of Dominion leadership. Nobody expected a single incident at a minor mining colony to force this kind of reassessment. But nobody expected a human commander to refuse a Dominion fleet commander's direct request either. And even fewer people expected that refusal to be backed by genuine strategic preparation rather than simple defiance. I sat with that information for a long time after she left, trying to understand exactly what it meant for the crew I commanded, for Captain Doran, who had returned to duty just days earlier and was still catching up on everything that had happened during his recovery, and for humanity as a whole, suddenly finding itself the subject of careful, urgent conversation among species that had barely acknowledged our existence a month earlier. Captain Doran called me into his quarters not long after that conversation, his voice still carrying traces of the damage from his earlier injury, though his mind was as sharp as ever. He had read every report from the engagement at Vesa Hold and the subsequent standoff with the Dominion cruiser, and I could not tell, watching his careful, measured expression, whether he approved of the decisions I had made in his absence or not. "You put this ship and this crew in a position that could have ended very differently," he said finally, after a long silence that stretched uncomfortably between us. "I know," I told him honestly. "I made the best decision I could with the information I had, and I stand by it. If given the same choice again, I would make the same call." He studied me for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, something in his expression softened into what I can only describe as quiet approval. "Good," he said. "Because that is exactly the decision I would have made myself, and exactly the decision command expected whoever held this chair to make, whether or not they said so directly beforehand. We do not train our officers to wait for permission when lives are at stake. We train them to act, and to answer for that action honestly afterward. You did both." I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was still tightly wound since the moment we first received that distress call, weeks earlier. It was not relief exactly. It was closer to confirmation, the quiet, steady understanding that the instincts I had trusted throughout that entire encounter had not been a reckless gamble, but exactly the kind of decisive judgment humanity had spent its entire history learning to value. Word continued spreading throughout the following weeks, and the shape of it grew stranger the further it traveled. Small colonies and outposts along the edges of contested space, places that had never previously reached out to human patrols for anything beyond routine trade coordination, began quietly requesting closer human presence in their sectors. Not formal alliance, not yet, but something smaller and more immediate, a growing recognition that when trouble arrived and every careful bureaucratic framework failed to respond quickly enough, humans had proven themselves willing to act, regardless of jurisdiction or formal authorization. Thurl described it to me one afternoon as we stood together on the observation deck, watching the quiet drift of stars beyond the viewport, a habit we had fallen into over the preceding weeks, whenever either of us needed space to think clearly. "It is a strange kind of reputation to build," she said. "Not one built on conquest, or expansion, or any of the traditional markers my people usually associate with a species becoming influential. It is built entirely on reliability, on the simple, unglamorous fact that when someone calls for help, humans answer, regardless of the cost or the complications that follow. I told her that reliability had never felt like a strategic choice to us. It felt like the only choice that made sense, given everything our history had taught us about what happens when help arrives too late. That is precisely what makes it so unsettling to everyone watching from outside your perspective, she said. My people have spent centuries building careful frameworks designed to manage conflict, to prevent exactly the kind of unchecked, immediate action that defined humanity's response at Vesa Hold. And now an entire region of space is beginning to realize that framework, however carefully constructed, has a gap in it large enough for real harm to slip through. A gap that only closed the moment a species outside that framework decided the gap was unacceptable and acted to close it themselves. I thought about Fleet Commander Vesik's voice during our exchange weeks earlier, the genuine uncertainty underneath his formal authority, as he processed exactly what kind of species he was actually dealing with. I wondered how many similar conversations were happening now, across councils and command centers throughout Dominion space, as leaders who had spent years treating humanity as a minor, contained curiosity, began quietly reassessing everything they thought they understood about us. Not everyone welcomed that reassessment. Thurl relayed reports of growing tension among more conservative factions within Dominion leadership, voices arguing that humanity's willingness to act outside established frameworks represented exactly the kind of dangerous instability her people had spent centuries working to prevent. These factions pushed for stricter enforcement of the threshold line, tighter restrictions on human movement near contested space, a return to the careful containment strategy that had defined relations between our species since first contact. But alongside those voices, Thurl described something else growing in parallel, quieter, but no less significant. Smaller species, ones without the resources or influence to shape major Dominion policy, ones who had spent years relying on careful diplomatic frameworks that consistently failed to protect them when it mattered most, began looking toward humanity with something that felt, unmistakably, like hope. We are not accustomed to being looked at that way, I told her honestly, one evening as we reviewed the latest diplomatic updates together. Feared, certainly, at times throughout our own history, distrusted, often. But hope is a strange, heavy thing to suddenly find yourself carrying on behalf of people you have never met. Thurl considered that for a long moment before answering. Perhaps that is precisely why it matters so much, she said. Because you did not seek it. You did not build your reputation through calculated diplomacy or careful positioning designed to win influence. You built it by simply refusing to look away when someone needed help. And everyone watching understood, almost immediately, the difference between a reputation earned that way and one built through deliberate strategy. I did not have a response ready for that, because I understood, even as she spoke it, that she had identified something true about what had happened, something that went beyond military doctrine or diplomatic strategy entirely. We had not set out to prove anything to the galaxy watching us. We had simply answered a call for help, the way our history had taught us to answer, and in doing so, had revealed something about ourselves that the rest of civilized space had never fully understood before. Captain Doran received formal notification near the end of that third week that Command intended to expand human patrol presence significantly beyond the current boundaries of the threshold line, not through conquest or unilateral expansion, but through a series of careful, mutually agreed arrangements with smaller species and outposts, requesting exactly the kind of reliable protection humanity had already demonstrated it was willing to provide. The Reckoning, he told me during a private briefing shortly afterward, has been selected to lead the initial expansion of that patrol presence. Command believes the crew that handled the situation at Vesa Hold is best positioned to establish the pattern going forward. I asked him what that meant, practically, for the weeks and months ahead, and his answer, though carefully measured, carried an unmistakable weight of significance. It means what happened at Vesa Hold was not an isolated incident, Voss. It was a beginning. The galaxy is recalculating what it thought it understood about us, and that recalculation is happening whether we are ready for it or not. I would rather this crew lead that process deliberately than have it happen to us without any say in the shape it eventually takes. I stood at the observation window that evening for a long time after our conversation ended, watching the same quiet stretch of stars Thurl and I had watched together so many times over the preceding weeks. And I understood, with a clarity that settled deep and steady in my chest, that everything that had happened since that first broken distress call was only the very beginning of something far larger than any of us aboard the Reckoning had ever anticipated. The galaxy had spent years believing it understood exactly what kind of species humanity was: young, contained, waiting patiently to be shaped by older, wiser civilizations who knew better. That belief had shattered in a single, decisive moment above a small, forgotten mining colony, and there was no putting it back together the way it had existed before. We had not become something new that day. We had simply been seen, clearly and completely, for the very first time, by a galaxy that had spent far too long looking away. 6 months passed before I finally had the chance to sit still long enough to understand exactly how much had changed since that first broken distress call reached the bridge of the Reckoning. 6 months is not a long time, not in the way the wider galaxy measured shifts in power and perception, but it was long enough to watch an entire region of space reshape itself around a single, simple truth that nobody had fully appreciated before Vesa Hold. Humans answered when called, and they did not wait for permission to do it. The Reckoning had grown into something different during those 6 months. Though her hull remained the same, her crew largely unchanged beyond the addition of a permanent liaison office near the observation deck, a small but significant addition that spoke to exactly how far things had come. Thurl occupied that office now, no longer a junior aide caught in the wrong place during a routine trade rotation, but a fully accredited representative working directly between her people and command, coordinating the growing network of arrangements that had sprung up across the region in the aftermath of that first engagement. I found her there one quiet evening, reviewing a stack of requests from outposts scattered along what used to be the outer edge of contested space, places that 6 months earlier would never have considered reaching out to a human patrol for anything beyond the most basic trade coordination. 17 new requests this week alone, she said, without looking up from her display as I entered. Small colonies, independent trade posts, 2 entire minor species who have never had formal contact with your command before now, all of them asking for the same thing. I asked her what that was, though I already suspected the answer. Reliability, she said simply. Not conquest, not protection through domination, just the simple, steady knowledge that if something goes wrong, someone will actually come. I sat across from her, the way I had so many times over the preceding months, and thought about how strange it was that something as simple as showing up when it mattered had reshaped an entire region's understanding of what humanity represented in the wider galaxy. Fleet Commander Vesic reached out again, she added after a moment, and I caught something careful in her tone that told me this update mattered more than the others. I asked her what he wanted. He has been reassigned, she said. Promoted, actually, following his report on the Vesa Hold engagement. It seems Dominion High Command valued his honest assessment of what happened, even when that assessment contradicted the assumptions most of his colleagues had held about humanity for years. He requested a formal meeting between your command and a delegation from the more progressive factions within Dominion leadership. Factions who believe the old containment strategy toward humanity was built on a fundamentally flawed premise. That news did not surprise me as much as it might have 6 months earlier. I had watched enough shift in the careful diplomatic language reaching us through official channels to understand that the galaxy's assumptions about humanity were being quietly, thoroughly rewritten, one careful conversation at a time. Captain Doran called me to the bridge later that same evening, his expression carrying the particular weight I had learned to recognize whenever something significant had crossed his desk. He gestured toward the main display, where a formal communication waited, marked with Dominion diplomatic seals I had come to recognize over the preceding months. They want to renegotiate the entire framework of the threshold line, he said without preamble, watching my reaction carefully as the words landed. Not eliminate it, not yet, but restructure it into something closer to a genuine partnership boundary, rather than a containment barrier. They are asking for our input directly, Voss, not simply our compliance. I stood quietly for a long moment, absorbing exactly how far things had traveled since the night I stood on this same bridge, with a distress signal breaking apart across my headset. uncertain whether the decision I was about to make would end my career, or worse, end in tragedy for everyone involved. "That is not a small request," I said finally. "No," he agreed. "It is not. And I suspect it is only the beginning of a much larger conversation this entire region of space is going to need to have, about what it actually means to share space with a species that never learned to wait for permission when lives were on the line." I thought about everything that had happened in the months since Vesa Hold, about the careful, steady expansion of human patrol presence into regions that had once fallen entirely outside our jurisdiction, welcomed not through force but through simple, repeated demonstration of exactly the kind of reliability Thurl had described earlier that evening. I thought about the small colonies who no longer hesitated before sending a distress call in our direction, no longer assumed silence would be the only answer they received. I thought too about the quieter, more uncomfortable conversations happening in parallel, the conservative factions within Dominion leadership, who viewed humanity's growing influence with genuine alarm, who saw in our willingness to act, without waiting for formal permission, not admirable decisiveness, but a dangerous precedent that threatened to unravel centuries of careful, deliberate governance. Not every reaction to what happened at Vesa Hold had been welcoming. Some of it had curdled into something closer to fear, and I understood, even as our influence grew, that fear rarely stayed contained for long before it demanded some kind of response. Thurl joined me on the observation deck later that night, after the formal briefing with Captain Doran had ended, and we stood together in the familiar quiet that had become such an important part of how both of us processed everything unfolding around us. "You are worried," she said, the same way she had said it so many times before, never quite a question, always simply an observation, offered gently enough that I could accept or dismiss it as I chose. I told her the truth, because by that point in our friendship, I owed her nothing less. "I am worried that becoming visible in this way, becoming something the wider galaxy watches closely and reacts to, carries risks we have not fully accounted for yet. We did not ask to become a symbol. We only wanted to answer a distress call that everyone else had decided was not worth answering." Thurl was quiet for a long moment, watching the same slow drift of stars we had watched together so many times before, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her in months. "I do not think you understand yet how far this has already traveled," she said carefully. "It is not only the Dominion recalculating its assumptions about your people. Word has reached further than that, into regions of space neither of us has ever had direct contact with. Older powers who have watched the balance of this galaxy remain relatively stable for a very long time. They are watching now too, Elena. Carefully, quietly. The way old, cautious things watch something new enter a space they thought they understood completely." I felt something settle in my chest at those words. Not quite fear, but something closer to sober recognition. We had answered one distress call, refused to back down from one confrontation, and in doing so had unsettled assumptions that had governed an entire region of space for longer than humanity had even existed as a spacefaring people. That kind of disruption did not simply fade quietly into the background once the initial shock passed. It rippled outward, further and further, until eventually it reached places neither of us could yet see clearly. "I do not regret what we did," I told her, and I meant it completely. "Whatever comes next because of it, I would make the same decision again, every single time, without hesitation." "I know," she said, something like quiet warmth returning to her voice despite the weight of everything else we had just discussed. "That is precisely why my people no longer see your kind the way they once did. Not simply as a young, unpredictable curiosity to be carefully managed and contained. Something closer to what my own history calls an apex presence. Not because you sought that position, not because you built your reputation through calculated strength or careful positioning, but because you proved, when it mattered most, that you would never simply look away." I thought about Fleet Commander Vesek's genuine uncertainty during our first confrontation, about the growing list of small colonies requesting closer human presence in their sectors, about the careful, cautious factions within Dominion leadership now quietly reassessing centuries of accumulated doctrine because of one decision made in the space of 4 seconds aboard a ship most of the galaxy had never previously bothered to notice. "We never wanted to be feared," I said quietly, more to myself than to Thurl, though she heard it clearly enough in the stillness of the observation deck. We only wanted to be the kind of people who showed up when it mattered. Perhaps, she said gently, that is exactly why you have become both. I stood there a long while after she finally left, alone with the quiet hum of the reckoning around me, and the endless, patient stretch of stars beyond the viewport, thinking about everything that had changed since that first broken transmission reached my headset months earlier. We had not set out to reshape how an entire region of the galaxy understood humanity. We had simply refused to let silence be our answer when someone called for help. And in refusing that silence, we had revealed something about ourselves that the wider galaxy had never fully understood. Something built, not from careful strategy or calculated ambition, but from centuries of hard, costly lessons learned entirely on our own, without any older civilization guiding our hand along the way. Somewhere out beyond the edges of everything we could currently see or measure, older, more cautious powers were beginning to take notice of exactly what had entered their galaxy, quietly, carefully, the way old and patient things always do, before deciding how they intend to respond. I did not know yet what that attention would eventually bring, whether it carried curiosity, caution, or something far more complicated neither Thurl nor I could yet fully name. But I knew this much, standing there on the observation deck with the whole vast unknown stretching endlessly ahead of us. Whatever waited out there, whatever older powers were now quietly watching from the shadows of that endless dark, they were going to find exactly the same thing Fleet Commander Vesic had discovered the moment he chose to test us above a small, forgotten mining colony that nobody else had considered worth saving. They were going to find a species that had already survived its own worst mistakes, that had already learned, the hard way, exactly what it costs to wait too long when someone needs help. A species that had never asked to be feared, and never needed anyone's permission to become exactly who we already were. Hunters do not announce themselves before the moment truly calls for it. They simply answer, clearly and completely, the very first time someone tests whether they will. The galaxy had spent years believing humanity was still waiting to be shaped into something they understood. They were only now beginning to realize the shaping had already happened, long before we ever reached the stars, and there was no version of the story that led back to the quiet, contained curiosity they had once assumed we would always remain. We had answered the call. We would keep answering it, every single time, for as long as it took the rest of the galaxy to fully understand exactly what that meant.